station, where unknown forces strike the edge of ecology.
So last night I finished watching the documentary Hyper-Normalisation, which is kind of doing the rounds at the moment. A few people recommended it to me. Seems to be a bit of a buzz around this documentary, and it's available to watch on YouTube, which is where I watched it. I'm not sure if it's going to be on there for long because I don't think it's strictly meant to be on there, but at the moment you can watch it on there. It's a long documentary. It's just under 3 hours, so it's very long. But I gave it a watch. I was only planning on watching an hour of it last night, but I ended up watching the whole thing because it's pretty captivating and it does grip you. So I just wanted to kind of provide a bit of an analysis really of the documentary and perhaps just give my thoughts, not really necessarily spoiling the documentary. I mean, I think if you listen to this, I would still highly recommend you go away and watch it because I can't cover 3 hours worth of content in a relatively short podcast episode. But first and foremost, I would say that I think generally it's good and it's worth watching, but it from my perspective, I think it really let itself down near the end, and for that reason, if I was going to give this thing a review, I would say it's a 7 out of 10, as opposed to some sort of great piece that is a must watch. So to summarise, so this is by a British documentarian journalist called Adam Curtis, who is an Oxford graduate, I think, historian, and has been around for a long time. He's I think, probably most well known, well, amongst other things, I think he's probably very well known for The Power of Nightmares, if I recall correctly, which came out in 2004, which, although is a documentary that's highly recommended and one that people keep saying I should watch, I've still not got around to watching it. I'm sure it's good, but possibly maybe a little dated now, but I very much doubt it is, because it's probably still quite relevant, some of the things it covers. But he's done many things, and it's always to do with power and the politics of power. That's really the theme that Curtis always covers in his documentaries and books. So Hyper-Normalisation, in summary, it's an attempt really to chronicle and explain and account for what's happened in society, particularly the West, since around 1975, so the last few decades. And the theory is essentially that we've been living a lie, a kind of illusion, where instead of being ruled by politics, we're essentially now ruled by finance and by banks and by this idea of the market being the kind of ultimate controlling force that we all must just abide by and follow. And that actually what politics now is essentially a game of risk management, and politicians are actually just managers now. It's corporate. It's a corporatization of the system, and in Curtis's view, governments are kind of meaningless now. They're certainly not like they were 100 years ago. We don't have this idea of the king or a supreme ruler who can make any kind of real changes to society, because every society is in a web, and that web is ultimately controlled by other forces. And this isn't necessarily other forces in terms of some agenda or controlling elites. This is more just the idea that it is just all about markets and economy and finance, and that's really it. And it's about just maintaining the status quo, keeping things afloat, and not necessarily trying to be some great politician or statesman that has aspirations of changing the world. All that kind of thing went out decades ago. So it's quite a dry view, and it's sort of like, I don't know, I guess you could class it as a sort of postmodern perspective. I always forget really what the academics mean when they talk about modernity. I used to know this stuff, but it's pretty grating in my opinion, and mostly just wishy-washy stuff. But for the first hour or so, I was pretty gripped, and I think it was very good. and it certainly covered on areas that I wasn't expecting it to cover on. So, for example, it really started off by saying that in the 70s, New York was in financial crisis, and they turned to the banks to just lend loans to the state. And for whatever reason, the federal government didn't want to help. So the city was close to being bankrupt, which seems crazy, but that was the case in the 1970s. And the banks lent New York so many loans, and eventually New York became so in debt to the banks that basically the banks just took over, and power shifted really from the state to private interests at that point, finance, and it kind of went from there. And then what it then does is it parallels that with what's going on in the Middle East. It talks about how Syria really has been central to everything that's happened over the last few decades. And what we've seen really is the West attempting to mitigate colossal mistakes that were made during Henry Kissinger's administration or time in government. I can't remember what his role. He was a statesman, but I can't remember what his position was. But he was very instrumental during the Cold War, and he was an advocate of mutually assured destruction. I think he was the inventor of it. Certainly a very prominent figure, and he's still around now. When you think he doesn't really have much say nowadays, but I suspect he still gives advice when and where it's requested for various people. Very influential figure. And Kissinger basically had this policy of not necessarily changing anything, but just suppressing, almost like damage reduction, almost like mitigating risk, and just keeping things afloat. And in order to keep things afloat, maybe having to betray certain parties in order to keep other parties happy. That's essentially where we're at. No great statesman, certainly no aspirations to do the right thing, nothing like that really is going on. So the idea is that Syria, and it all goes back to the Israel situation really, Syria basically was an advocate of the idea that the Palestinians should return to certain parts of the West Bank. And the original Assad, the father of Bashar al-Assad, who is now in power in Syria, just about, he wanted to basically get America at the table to negotiate something along those lines, and basically he was an advocate of a peace settlement and peace negotiation. And to cut a long story short, he introduced the idea of the suicide bomber, or actually no, I think the Iranians did, but it spread across the Middle East because eventually the US Marines went into certain parts of the West Bank during a conflict that Israel was having, and there was a massacre, and many Palestinians were killed in this massacre, which was actually done by the Christians, but the Israelis stood back and let it happen. And the Marines went in to try and kind of enforce the peace really, and a suicide bomber then killed 200 odd US Marines in the 1980s, and as a result of that, America pulled out, and basically everything changed at that point. America became less interested in the idea of a peace settlement in the Israel situation, and everyone kind of went from there really in terms of where we're at now with Israel, and nothing's really ever going to change. It's just a perpetual war and conflict. But at the same time as that, you had build-ups to things like the Iraq War in the 90s, where Tony Blair infamously talked about the idea of weapons of mass destruction, which never existed. And this was the point in the documentary where I felt certainly most touched, and I really was quite emotional at times, because it showed the old footage of 2003 when Tony Blair was all over the BBC News talking at length about how there were weapons of mass destruction and how we had to fight Saddam. We had to go in, and then there were shots of a million people marching in the square of London, and we all know what happened. Nothing changed the fact that Blair was adamant that we had to go in. Same thing in the US with George Bush Jr. So essentially what the premise of this documentary is it's saying that politicians are following a certain trajectory, and it's not about what the people want, it's just about what's best for the status quo and what's best to maintain the market and to keep things afloat, to keep everyone happy. So that's really the gist of it. I mean, that's really a summary. That's an unbelievable summary because it's a 3-hour long documentary, but I can't really cover every point. But what I would say about this documentary is that it was good up to that point, particularly with regards to, like I said, the Iraq War, because that, basically I look back on that now, and I'm the age now where I was an 18-year-old then, and I had unbelievable amounts of energy, and I thought that actually we could change the world. I was reading David Icke books and things and getting really into it, and I was involved in those protests, not in London but where I am down in the south. But absolutely nothing changed, and then the documentary went on to say that people at that time kind of felt completely just basically despondent about politics ever since, and retreated into virtual worlds and played online games and retreated into cyberspace. And that's exactly what I did do, quite honestly, for years. And even now I'm still guilty of that in some ways, but not so much. So it talks a lot about that, and it talks a lot about how there was a counterculture which was all about the Silicon Valley, San Francisco types who were pioneers of the internet. And these were people who really wanted to embrace the new technology and create a true democracy and a kind of almost breakaway kind of society, which sounds really fanciful, but that was the idea. And these are people like Timothy Leary, who you saw an interview of in the documentary. He was talking it from a very early period. And then there was a little shot of Terence McKenna, which I thought was great. It was good to see Terence McKenna in the documentary, but he didn't speak and he was never referenced, but you just saw him in an archive clip in the back, which I thought was quite cool, hanging with all the sort of San Francisco types in the early 90s, looking at VR, which was it's funny to see the VR because they were talking about VR then like it was the next big thing, which obviously now is again resurfacing, but the tech seems obviously a lot better. But anyway, the idea was that those guys were going to change the world, and that never quite happened because ultimately this documentary claims, and I think it's probably right, sadly, none of this technology came from nowhere. It's always been authorised and ultimately developed by the state and by corporate interests, and they're really the people who pioneer most of this stuff. And it's certainly the case now with the big corporations controlling the data centres and the massive data that we've accumulated, the speed, the internet, the infrastructure. It's all controlled by corporations, and it's all really there so corporations can make money and harvest our information. Social media and that is kind of a byproduct of it, and it's good, but it's turned us into I guess we've kind of been brainwashed by a lot of this stuff, and we're easy to manage. And the documentary kind of talks a bit about that. It goes on to say that what's really happened now is that because most of us in the West is sort of in, and it's got a very British and American bias. It doesn't really talk about any other country really. It's just about the West, or kind of the Anglosphere really. But I think that's probably the sort of prime. I think it's not necessarily debatable. I think it's absolutely the case that the world kind of goes along with what the Anglosphere ends up doing at the moment, at least. It really, people have become disillusioned by politics to the point where they've retreated into social media, into cyberspace, and now they've become completely obsessed with it. And famous psychologists and creators of this technology in the sort of 70s and 80s predicted that what would happen is people would end up basically being controlled by algorithms, and these algorithms would predict what people want next in their life, whether it be a product or an event. And that's essentially what has happened. companies like Amazon have now created very, very clever algorithms that will predict everything you've purchased and send you an email saying, would you be interested in, we think you might like this, or you like this, you're going to love this kind of thing, and send you a link to some new product. And people generally see those emails and think, you know what, actually I do want one of those. I mean, a lot of people do, not everyone. And Facebook's the same. Facebook harvests data, uses algorithms to work out what it thinks you're going to want to see on your news feed and in the ads if you don't use adblock software. Most people don't. And it's just a case of algorithms making intelligent decisions about you based on your habits. So, but people might generally lap it up, and this is the problem. And this goes back to what Adam Curtis is saying, because Adam Curtis goes on really to say near the end of the documentary that this is all really where we're at now. So people are not really interested in politics, they're disillusioned by politics, and they just live in their social media bubbles, and to them everything's a cartoon, because that's what social media is. It's just a fake reality that you're happy to live in, and you don't really want to accept that there's real problems out there, like serious issues that need to be addressed, like things like world events that are unfolding, like Syria and all this stuff. People care, but they don't care enough to really go out of their way, because they feel that they don't really feel like we can really change anything. So anyway, after all was said and done, and up to this point in the documentary I was thinking, yeah, this is pretty good stuff. Then all of a sudden I think it really lets itself down, because what happens is Adam Curtis then references the fact that because of the situation with suicide bombers in the Middle East and the fact that the Israeli situation has never been resolved and we betrayed Syria. Actually, I must say this before I go on to make this main point. The documentary also does talk a lot about Libya and how Gaddafi was used as a sort of pawn in a game that went on for decades, and America and Britain used Gaddafi for all manner of different nefarious kind of political quests. And at one point he was the enemy, and he was like the James Bond villain, potentially firing missiles at Italy from Africa and all this kind of thing. But then all of a sudden they felt the need to embrace, particularly during the Iraq War, because the Iraq War went sour pretty quick due to the sectarian violence that happened after the initial invasion. So America and Britain decided that they wanted to get Libya to act as if they had seen the Iraq War and thought, my God, we might be next. So Gaddafi then came out and said, you know what, we've got loads of nuclear and weapons of mass destruction, but we're going to surrender them all because we don't want to be invaded. And as a result, he became this great hero and was grandstanded all over the world for a year or so. But then all of a sudden, and Gaddafi's son went on to say, well, look, this was all fabrication, because this was just them. Basically, this was just blackmail. This was kind of like just saying, you know what, you can be our friend now, and as a result, you're going to get all this kind of media attention, which is ultimately what Gaddafi fed off. But as a result of that, we are going to want things from you, and that's kind of what happened. And as a result, that I think people at the time felt that Gaddafi was suddenly a changed, reformed character. But then years later, when it became politically convenient, they switched it, and then they said, well, actually no, Gaddafi's a bad man. So anyway, long tangents, I know, but it's just one that when I'm talking about this documentary, a lot of things keep coming to mind because so much is covered, almost too much really. But where I feel this documentary basically lets itself down after all of this information, which I think mostly is spot on, is it never talks about the idea of there being an agenda behind any of this. It never talks about the idea that if there is this great terrorist faction that's formed and is becoming this sort of sweeping force all across the Middle East. Who's trained them? Who's funded them? And is it feasible to suggest that perhaps it goes deeper than to just say it's Iran? It could end up being more to do with Western intelligence agencies actually wanting to create a kind of proxy army to take out regimes they don't like. And this is a theory that many people are advocates of. This Syria conflict is all about a war from our perspective, a war by forces that are loyal to the Assad now, the son of the original Assad, and ISIS, and who is ISIS, and all this kind of thing. It never really goes into that, and it never really covers the idea that if this is all true, what are the solutions? I don't think really Adam Curtis. I get the sense that he doesn't really feel that there is a solution. It's almost as if he just thinks, well, look, this is the situation. The world's basically screwed, and we're all just sheep being controlled by the banks, and there's no such thing as politics, and the world's really complicated, and no one's got a handle on it, and there's nothing that can be done. And yeah, it's quite a morbid, dark view. And even from a technologist perspective, it's dark because I didn't get the sense that Adam Curtis feels that technology can save us. I think he feels that it's just another way of controlling us and using us to further the market's interests, really. But anyway, the final criticism I have of it, which I think is the main one, is it kind of uses this 2.5 hour build-up to then do this extremely, extremely lazy slamming of Brexit, because what it basically does is says, and all of this disillusionment with politics and with the fear of the Middle East and with terrorists has ended up creating a situation where we've got Brexit on our hands, and Brexit is a real situation, and he goes on to kind of make out like it's actually a seriously bad thing, a terrible thing, a awful event. And this is where I felt like, well, come on, Adam, you spent 2.5 hours saying that the world is controlled by a bureaucracy and politics is no longer existent, and the good old days of there being politicians that feel that they can change something is long gone. But then you slam Brexit. But surely Brexit, most people voted for Brexit from what I've gathered, certainly from what I've read online, and when you get the general vibe when you listen to radio shows and things and people call in, the general feel I get is that many people voted for Brexit because they felt that we were no longer controlled by politicians, we were controlled by a bureaucracy. And people don't like that. People in the UK, I think, instinctively don't like that. It's not in our DNA. So how can you be so condemning of Brexit? It doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, because I felt like, sure, there were people that are just racist and they vote Brexit because they don't like people from Eastern Europe or whatever coming into their city. But what's to say that that's the be-all, that's the only reason, I think, is all I'm trying to say. And I think Adam Curtis kind of lazily went along with this kind of liberal left's media, really. And this was a BBC programme. This was made by the BBC and put on the iPlayer as a first port of call. I'm sure it's going to get distribution rights on other networks. But essentially there was an unbelievable bias there. And the BBC has been called out for it. The BBC are extremely biased when it comes to the EU. They're so pro-EU, it's just unbelievable. So transparent. But that was my biggest criticism. And then it went on to say the same thing about Trump. It went on to kind of almost predict that Trump's going to win, which at the moment looks like it's very likely to happen. Well, actually, I don't know about very likely, but it looks like it's essentially neck and neck at the moment. Certainly kind of this early stage of November where I've put out this episode. 2016, it looks like it's neck and neck. But Adam Curtis goes on to say that, well, look, the only reason this has happened is because people fear all of this stuff, like the terrorists and things. And it's like, well, I'm not so sure they do. I think perhaps it's also a disillusionment with politics, which was the guy's original premise at the start of the documentary. So why be so anti-Trump and so anti-Brexit? Why not say, well, look, these are just reactions to a situation where people feel under threat from bureaucracies and from corruption and from bankers. And he never really goes there. Instead, he just says, as a result of all this horror that's happened over the last 30, 40 years, we've ended up doing something really stupid. We've voted to leave the EU, and in America, they've got Trump sort of as a runner for the president. And it's like, I'm sorry, that's just such a lazy, inept, and just completely anticlimactic ending to your 2.5 hour documentary. So I was that kind of sums it up really. I think it was good up until a point, but then it felt like a piece of unbelievable propaganda really, that ultimately was just there to kind of try and make out like, I'm not even sure what it was. It was basically very disjointed, because really if it's gonna say that the world is now a sort of illusion where we don't have politics, then why be pro EU? Because the EU is nothing more than a massive bureaucracy, and it's not necessarily all bad. I'm not one of those people that just thinks it's completely awful. I think it's just got too big for its boots, and I think people just instinctively feel that we need to rein in the power a bit and not centralise it so much, because that's really what the EU wants. Certainly politicians really want. So what's the point of making a 2.5 hour documentary to conclude that it's wrong that we voted Brexit? It's I don't know. It's something about it just didn't seem right to me, and it felt almost as if, don't want to speculate, but it felt almost as if his hand was forced by the BBC, or as if the documentary was made, but then Brexit happened and they had to update the conclusion, make a change. Perhaps it was a bit rushed. Who knows? It just felt that way to me. But anyway, hypernormalisation, and it's good and it's worth seeing, and it's certainly, I've been thinking about it all day, which is why I kind of wanted to do an episode on it. But I would just say, if you do watch it, certainly I like to think that if you're a subscriber to the podcast, this podcast and other obviously sort of alternative podcasts, you're going to be quite an informed person. You're not going to get any great revelations from this documentary. I think perhaps the most interesting thing is just the factual stuff about names and about dates and about like just small snippets of information where you just think, oh, that's interesting. Stuff like that's quite cool. But the actual kind of running theme of it, I think, is flawed, unfortunately, because it doesn't quite go far enough. And there's other small issues with it as well, like it kind of sweeps through 9/11, doesn't really cover any idea that 9/11 could have been I don't know, an inside job or false flag, whatever you want to call it. And I'm still open-minded about that. I'm not saying I believe it 100% was, but I think it's a big enough issue there. There's a big enough question mark where you can't, as a journalist, just ignore the fact that the story doesn't seem to add up. The mainstream official line doesn't seem to tally with the facts. So I just feel like it's lazy journalism and it's not quite going far enough. But then again, after all said and done, it's a BBC piece, so it's not going to be overly out there. I just wish this guy would go on to make independent films and not just work for the BBC. But there you go.
The information where unknown forces strike the edge of ecology.